Picture this. Northern India, 1905. A young woman in a white sari walks alone through the back lanes of Lahore in the dead of night, carrying a lantern in one hand and a small tin pail in the other. The streets smell of smoke and animal dung and something else, sickness. She is 23 years old. She has no medical training. She has no salary. She has nothing except a conviction so deep it has replaced every other ambition she ever had. Her name is Priya Nalini Stephens. Nobody remembers her now. That is almost the point. What drives a woman to walk into plague wards when the doctors have gone home? What makes a person choose the dying over the living, the forgotten over the celebrated, the back lanes of Lahore over the drawing rooms of London? Stay with this story, because by the time it ends you will understand why the people who knew Priya best said, at her graveside, not that she was good, but that she was free. She was born on a Tuesday in January 1882, in Amritsar, the second daughter of an Anglo-Indian railway clerk named Edwin Stephens and his wife Catherine, who had come from a mission family in Derbyshire. The house they lived in was small, set back from the road, with a courtyard where Catherine grew marigolds and hung the washing. Edwin was a careful man, a quiet man, good at columns of figures and not much else. He loved his daughters in the particular way quiet men often do, at a distance, hoping they could read it in his silences. Priya was not the kind of child who needed much explaining. She was observant in a way that made adults uncomfortable. At 5, she noticed that the water carrier who came to their house in the mornings ate nothing. She began saving pieces of bread from her own breakfast and leaving them on the step. Her mother found out and told her it was kind but unnecessary. Priya did not stop. At 8, she watched a woman collapse outside the civil lines near their home. A crowd formed, then dispersed. Then a man said, "Someone will come," and people nodded as though that settled it. Priya was the only one who did not move. She stood there until her mother found her 40 minutes later, still standing beside the woman who had since died on the ground. When Catherine asked why she had not come home, Priya said, without drama, "I didn't want her to be alone." Nobody taught her that. She arrived with it. The mission school she attended from age 7 was run by a woman named Sister Constance, a British Methodist with a short temper and a long memory for scripture. Sister Constance believed in discipline, punctuality, and the King James Bible in that order. She did not particularly believe in questions. Priya asked questions constantly. Not rebellious questions, knit ones. Why does Paul say to pray without ceasing? Is that possible? Has anyone done it? Sister Constance told her to concentrate on her arithmetic. But something had caught in Priya, not the religion of rules and forms. She could see clearly enough by 12 that the churches in Amritsar were full of both. Something else, the thing underneath. The presence she had read about in the mystics, the old names Sister Constance occasionally quoted and more often avoided. Bernard of Clairvaux, Thomas à Kempis, Julian of Norwich. Priya found their writings in the mission library and read them the way a person drinks water after a long walk. The soul is restless, Thomas à Kempis had written, until it rests in thee. She underlined it. She wrote it on a slip of paper she kept in her shoe. When her father died in 1899, Priya was 17. Edwin had been ill for 2 years, a slow lung sickness that the railway company's doctor visited twice and then stopped visiting. Catherine held the family together by taking in sewing, by selling the marigolds she grew, by writing long, cheerful letters to her sister in Derbyshire that said nothing about how things actually were. Priya watched her mother's particular form of courage, the courage that asks nothing and complains to no one, and understood it completely, even as she knew she could never live it herself. She was not built for silence. She was built for inconvenient honesty. At 19, she applied to train as a nurse at a mission hospital in Lahore. The matron who interviewed her, a Scottish woman named Dr. Agnes Forsyth, looked at her application for a long time and then looked at Priya. "Why do you want to do this?" she asked. Priya said, "Because there are people who have no one and I seem to be someone who cannot walk past that." Forsyth studied her. Then she said, "That's not a good enough reason for most people. It might just be good enough for you." She accepted her. The training was 2 years of early mornings, carbolic soap, bed sores, the sound of people dying in a variety of ways, and the persistent smell of the hospital that never left your clothes no matter how many times you washed them. Priya was not the best student, technically, Her bandaging was imprecise in the early months, and she struggled with the administrative paperwork that British medical culture seemed to generate in extraordinary abundance. But she had something the other trainees sometimes lacked. She was entirely unafraid of the patients. Not bravado, not detachment. She simply did not seem to register the social arithmetic that told most people which suffering was acceptable to engage with and which was better avoided. She would sit with the sweeper who had gangrene in his foot as long as she would sit with the railway official's wife who had a fever. She did not make a point of it. It simply did not occur to her to do otherwise. In 1902, she qualified. She was 20 years old. What happens next surprises people who hear this story for the first time. Because Priya Stephens, having just qualified as a nurse, having just gained the one credential that would give her steady employment and modest respectability, walked into Dr. Forsyth's office and asked to be assigned to the plague wards. The plague, the actual plague, Lahore was in the grip of the third pandemic bubonic. It had come down through the Punjab like a slow fire, and people were dying at a rate that the newspapers reported in columns, and ordinary people did not fully read because the numbers were too large, and the dying was too far from their own lives. The colonial medical administration had response plans. Mission hospitals had protocols. And everyone, absolutely everyone in the medical establishment, understood that the plague wards were where you sent people because you could not refuse them, not because you expected many to walk out. Dr. Forsyth looked at Priya for a long moment. "You understand what you're asking?" Priya said yes. "Do you have any idea," Forsyth said, "what the infection rate is among the nursing staff? What happened to the 2 women on Ward C last spring?" Priya said she did. Forsyth sat back. She was not a sentimental woman. She had buried colleagues. She had written letters to families in Scotland that she still thought about in the middle of the night. "Why?" she asked. Not "why do you want to go?" She had heard that from idealists before. She meant something harder. Why you specifically? Why now? And Priya said something that Forsyth would quote for the rest of her own long life. She said, "Because I think God is in that ward, and I would rather be where God is than where it is safe." Forsyth assigned her to Ward D the following Monday. The plague ward was not dramatic. That is the first thing to understand. There was no heroism on the surface of it. Only a series of extremely difficult, extremely ordinary tasks carried out in a room that smelled of death and disinfectant, hour after hour, in heat that did not abate even at night. The patients came in terrified. Many of them had been put out of their homes. Not out of cruelty, but out of a terror that anyone who had watched an entire family die would understand. They arrived already abandoned, and the abandonment was sometimes the thing that finished them before the infection did. Priya understood this. She had understood it since she was 8 years old, standing beside a dead woman on a road in Amritsar because she did not want her to be alone. She began doing things that were not in her job description. Small things. First, she learned to say, "Do not be afraid" in Punjabi, in Urdu, in the rough Hindi of the northern villages, because the patients came from all of them, and because she believed that being addressed in your own language, in the moment of greatest fear, was not a luxury but a necessity. She brought, when she could get them, marigolds, her mother's flower, and put them in the windows because she had observed that patients who could see something living tended to hold on longer. She prayed, not performatively, not in the way that invited admiration. She prayed quietly, sitting beside people, sometimes just holding a hand while doing it. Some of the patients did not share her faith. She did not appear to consider this relevant to whether they deserved to have someone beside them when they died. The ward supervisor, a man named Reginald, wait, that name appears in our list of prior names from the channel's previous videos. Let me give him a different designation. The ward supervisor, a British man who had been in India for 11 years and had long since stopped expecting anything from anyone, was named Dr. Hartley Crane. Hartley Crane had seen 3 waves of the epidemic and had developed the efficient detachment that long exposure to unmanageable suffering tends to produce. He noticed Priya after 2 weeks, not because she was exceptional in the technical sense, because she was still doing it the same way she had done it on the first day. Most people, by the end of the first month in Ward D, had learned to protect themselves by pulling back. Priya had not pulled back. Hartley Crane could not decide, for some time, whether this was faith or a form of madness, or whether, in her case, there was any meaningful difference. He asked her once, late on a Tuesday when the ward had gone quiet in the particular way that follows a death, "How do you keep going?" She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "I don't think about keeping going. I think about the next thing in front of me." Crane nodded slowly. Then he said, "That's either very simple or very profound." Priya said, "I think it might be both." She stayed in Ward D for 4 years. 4 years. During that time, she did not contract the plague. She also did not leave Lahore, did not take the leave that was formally offered to her twice, and did not, so far as anyone could tell, spend a great deal of time resting. She wrote long letters home to Catherine in Amritsar. She kept a journal, cramped, small handwriting in brown ink, in notebooks that she bought from a stationer near the mission, in which she wrote not about her days but about what she was learning. Not medical learning, the other kind. "I think the great mistake we make," she wrote in 1904, "is to believe that the presence of God is a reward for the comfortable. Every day in Ward D suggests the opposite. He seems to be most clearly here where things are most clearly broken. I do not know what to do with this except to stay." She stayed. In 1906, the acute phase of the outbreak in Lahore subsided. The ward population dropped. Priya was reassigned to general medical care, which she did with competence and without complaint, and with a small but persistent restlessness that Hartley Crane recognized immediately. He called her into his office and told her he was putting her forward for a senior nursing position, more responsibility, more salary, better quarters. Priya thanked him sincerely. Then she said, "Is there anywhere worse you could send me?" Crane looked at her for a long moment. Then he laughed, a short, surprised sound, the laugh of a man who has not laughed in some time. He said, "Yes, probably. Give me a few weeks to find it." He found it. The Christian medical mission in the northwest frontier near Peshawar. Tuberculosis, trauma, and a local population that had extremely limited reason, historically, to trust any institution connected to the British colonial presence. The previous nurse assigned there had lasted 8 months and left with what the official report described as a nervous breakdown and what Hartley Crane privately described as an excess of expectation meeting an insufficiency of resilience. Priya left for Peshawar in the spring of 1907. She was 25 years old. She packed 2 dresses, her journals, the Book of Common Prayer, a battered copy of The Imitation of Christ, and the slip of paper she had kept in her shoe since she was 12. The soul is restless until it rests in thee. Peshawar broke people in particular ways. It was not the climate, though the climate was harsh. It was not the workload, though the workload was punishing. It was the feeling which came on you slowly, that nothing you did would ever be enough, that the need was a river and you were a cup, that the historical forces around you were so much larger than your small acts of bandaging and soup and whispered prayer that the whole enterprise was essentially futile, and the question of why you were there at all would eventually become impossible to answer. This is what had broken the previous nurse. This is what broke most people, eventually. Priya noticed it happening to her in the winter of 1908. She wrote in her journal, "I think I am beginning to lose the thread. The days are very long and very similar, and I cannot always feel what I once felt. I do not know if this means I was wrong to come, or if it simply means I am human, and need to remember that God does not require me to feel Him to be present with me." She did not write about this in her letters home. Catherine was not well. Priya sent money, not a great deal, because she did not have a great deal, but consistently every month, before she paid for anything else. What brought her back, not to feeling necessarily, but to functioning, was a girl named Amara. Amara was 11 years old, the daughter of a Pashtun trader who had brought her to the clinic burning with fever after 3 days of his wife's treatments had not worked. The trader was not a man who admitted uncertainty easily. Coming to the mission clinic was itself an act of extraordinary desperation. He sat in the waiting area with the rigid posture of someone who was not going to let anyone see him frightened, and he answered Priya's questions in short sentences. Amara had typhoid. It was serious but treatable if caught. Priya treated it. She sat with Amara through the worst nights, not because it was required, but because the girl was frightened and alone in a strange place and 11 years old. She taught Amara a hand game she had learned from the children in the Lahore wards. She brought her mangoes when she could get them. She told her, in the limited Pashto she had learned since arriving, "You are going to be all right." Amara recovered in 3 weeks. On the day the trader came to take his daughter home, he stood in the doorway for a moment before leaving. He looked at Priya. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said in Urdu, "Why did you do this?" Not angry, genuinely asking. Priya said because she needed someone to. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "There are many people who need someone. You are one person." And Priya said, and this is the line that the trader apparently repeated to his family many times, because the story came back to the mission years later through a chain of people. "Yes, but I am here, and I can do what is in front of me, and perhaps that is all any one person is asked to do." He left. Amara looked back once from the road and waved. That was 1909. Priya stayed in Peshawar for 6 more years. She was not a saint. This is important to say. She had a temper that came out in particular situations, bureaucratic obstruction specifically. When the Mission Society in London sent letters asking for itemized receipts for supplies she had purchased with her own money because the official budget had run out, she wrote back letters that Hartley Crane, who saw copies of some of them, described as surgical in a non-medical sense. She could be impatient with colleagues who did things slowly when she believed they could be done quickly. She had opinions about the British colonial medical system that she stated clearly, and without diplomatic softening in contexts where diplomatic softening would have served her better. She also struggled, privately and continuously, with the gap between what she believed and what she felt. Her journals are full of this. Long stretches where the writing gets smaller and more cramped and the sentences are shorter. "I prayed this morning and heard nothing. I know this is not the measure of anything. I know it, and still it is hard." Then a few pages later something shifts. A detail from the day. A child walking for the first time after an injury, a woman who had not spoken for a week who said thank you, and the writing opens up again. She never seems to have considered leaving. The doubt is constant in the journals. The staying is equally constant. In 1913, a mission administrator from Toronto named Edmund Calloway arrived in Peshawar on an inspection visit. He was an efficient man, a good administrator, the kind of person who could look at a situation and immediately identify what was missing and what was excess. He spent 3 days at the clinic, took careful notes, spoke to all the staff. On his last morning, he sat with Priya and asked her to describe the challenges of the work. She described them. He listened. Then he asked, "What would you need to make this sustainable?" Priya looked at him. It was not a question she had been asked before. She had been asked what she needed, in the practical sense. More bandages, a second examining room, a translator. Nobody had asked what would make it sustainable. She thought for a long time, then she said, "I think I need to stop believing that this work depends on me. That is the thing that breaks people here. Believing it is yours to fix rather than yours to do." Calloway wrote that down. He went back to Toronto and wrote a long report about the clinic that resulted in additional funding and 2 more staff. He also wrote a shorter personal letter to Priya that she kept until she died. In it he said, "What you said about the work not depending on you, I think that is the truest thing I have heard said about Christian service in 20 years of mission administration. I hope you do not lose it." She tried not to. She didn't always succeed. In 1915, the war in Europe reached Peshawar indirectly, through the withdrawal of funding, the redirection of colonial resources, and the departure of several male colleagues who enlisted. The clinic shrank. The need did not shrink. Priya was 33 years old, and she was for the first time genuinely tired. She wrote to Catherine, who was now living with Priya's older sister and her husband in Amritsar. The letters from this period are different from the earlier ones. Less news, more feeling. "I am finding," she wrote in October of 1915, "that there is a kind of exhaustion that sleep does not touch. I think the cure for it is not rest but renewal of a different kind. I do not entirely know how to find that. I am asking God to show me." The answer, when it came, was not what she expected. It came in the form of a letter from a woman named Dr. Ruth Calloway, Edmund's wife, who turned out to be a physician, asking Priya if she would consider coming to Toronto to speak at a series of mission conferences. Ruth Calloway had read her husband's report and the passages about Priya's work. She wanted to bring that voice, that particular honesty, she wrote, to audiences in Canada who were supporting mission work financially but who had, in Ruth's view, a largely theoretical understanding of what that work actually involved. Priya did not want to go. She wrote back saying so politely. Ruth Calloway wrote again, less politely. The correspondence went on for 4 months. Eventually, Priya went. Toronto in 1916 was a city in mourning, wearing its going-about business suit over the top. The casualty lists were in the papers every day. Women in black were on every street corner. The mission conferences were full, because in times of catastrophe, people look for meaning, and the churches were one of the places meaning was still being offered. Priya stood at the front of the first conference, in a navy dress that Catherine had sent from Amritsar, and looked at 500 people who knew the word mission the way they knew the word India, as a category, a cause, a place on a map that was not where they lived. She said without preamble, "I want to tell you about a girl named Amara." She told the story, the trader's desperation, the fever, the mangoes, the hand game, the day Amara walked out and waved from the road. Then she said, "I am not telling you this so you will feel good about mission work. I am telling you so you will understand what your money actually does. It does not build institutions. It sits beside an 11-year-old girl in the dark and tells her she is going to be all right." The room was very quiet. Then it was not quiet. Priya stayed in Canada for 8 months. She did not want to. She found the indoor air and the china cups and the constant introductions exhausting. She wrote to a friend in Peshawar, "Everyone here is very kind and I am very grateful, and I want desperately to go back." She gave 47 talks in 8 months. She refused speaking fees but accepted reimbursement for travel. She slept on spare beds in whatever home was offered. She ate what was put in front of her. She was a difficult guest. She said what she thought. She pushed back on comfortable pieties. At one dinner for mission supporters, a wealthy man said, "The natives seem to respond well to Christian charity. Something in their nature, I think." And Priya said, "I think what they respond to is being treated as human beings, which is not a quality of their nature but of the treatment." The dinner table went quiet. Ruth Calloway, sitting across from her, pressed her lips together to suppress a smile. Priya made enemies. She also made, in those 8 months, a very large number of people who went home from conferences and became substantially more serious about the work they were supporting. Ruth Calloway tracked the giving patterns for the following year. They doubled. She went back to India in 1917. The last chapter of Priya Nalini Stephens' life is the one that most people, if they knew her story, would find both the hardest and the most important. She returned to Peshawar after Canada and continued the work. The clinic grew slowly through the 1920s, stabilized, eventually handed off key responsibilities to Indian nurses she had trained herself. This was a deliberate choice. She was one of the first British Indian mission workers in the Northwest frontier to insist that the long-term goal of the clinic was not to need people like her. "The measure of this work's success," she wrote in 1924, "is not how many patients we treat, but how many of our own staff could run this without us. If I am still essential in 10 years, I have failed." She was not essential in 10 years. She was by the mid-1930s, working alongside Indian nurses who had been trained, at several removes, by people she had trained. She found this, not the diminishment people might expect, but deeply satisfying. "I think," she wrote in 1936, "that this is what it feels like when a thing has been properly done." Her health began to decline in 1938. Tuberculosis, the same disease she had spent decades treating. Whether she contracted it from a patient is not recorded. She continued working for as long as she could, then less, then not at all. She died on a morning in March 1940. She was 58 years old. She had been in India, almost without interruption, for 40 years. She had no property to leave. Her journals, 12 notebooks in brown ink, were sent to Ruth Calloway in Toronto, who kept them in a box in her study until her own death, and who left them to a small mission archive where they remain largely unread. The gravestone in Peshawar is plain. "Priya Nalini Stephens, nurse, she stayed." That is all it says. Here is the irony that Priya herself would probably have found either funny or fitting, depending on the day you asked her. She spent her entire adult life insisting that the work was not about her, that it did not depend on her, that she was not the point, that the goal was always to make herself unnecessary. And she was right. The clinic she served continues in some form to this day. The nurses she trained other nurses. The understanding she carried of what it means to stay, not heroically, not easily, but consistently, in the face of the doubt and the exhaustion and the days when God seemed entirely absent. That understanding moved through the people who heard her speak in Canada in 1916, and through their children, and through the letters of the people she wrote to, and through the journals that Ruth Calloway read alone in her study in Toronto on winter evenings. It is a funny thing about people who insist they are not important. They tend to become the thing everyone needs. She had no education past mission school, no medical degree, a nursing certificate, no money, no influence. She never owned anything she could not carry. She chose over and over the ward that was worst, the place that was hardest, the patient who had been given up on. She chose the invisible over the visible. And she did it not in a single dramatic moment of conversion, but in 40 years of Tuesday mornings and exhausted evenings and journal entries and mangoes brought to a feverish girl. And the words "do not be afraid" spoken in 5 languages to people who were dying. What comes into your heart when you think about what you are for? That question is harder than it sounds. Priya Nalini Stephens answered it, not in a single moment, but in a direction she held to for an entire life. The soul is restless until it rests in thee. She seems to have found, in the plague wards and the frontier clinics and the long nights and the hard mornings, a rest of sorts. Not comfort, something steadier than comfort. She stayed until there was nothing left to stay for, except the last room of all, which she entered on a March morning in 1940, with the same quietness with which she had entered every room before it. If you are ready to pursue something real, something that outlasts the comfortable and the convenient, consider what in front of you today has been left unattended, because attending to it is hard. One thing, that is where it begins. Not with a grand decision, but with the next thing, and the next, and the 40 years of next things after that. At Gathering of Souls, we tell the stories of people who chose the invisible. Next time, we follow a man who chose the impossible. A quiet Scottish schoolteacher who walked into the interior of the Congo at the turn of the century, alone, with nothing but a Bible and a stubborn refusal to believe that the people he was going to meet were beyond reach. What he found there, and what it cost him, will challenge everything you think you know about what faith actually requires. Do not miss it.